Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. We're breaking with our usual format this week. We're featuring one interview on one news outlet, the British newspaper The Guardian. Why? Certainly not because of the paper's size. There are 10 newspapers in the UK with larger circulations. We're looking at The Guardian through its editor, Alan Rusbridger, because the paper has been at the center of two of the biggest media stories of the past 18 months. The phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's News of the World that rocked journalism, and the Wikileaks story. It was The Guardian that put together the deal that brought Wikileaks into a collaboration with mainstream news outlets like the New York Times and Germany's Der Spiegel, and shook global diplomacy and politics. And one reporter, Nick Davies, played a key role in both the phone hacking and Wikileaks stories. I sat down with Alan Rusbridger in London to talk about Rupert Murdoch, phone hacking, Wikileaks, and the future of journalism in the digital age. Alan Rusbridger, thanks for joining us here at The Listening Post.
Very pleased to be here.
The phone hacking story has been called Rupert Murdoch's Watergate, or a British Watergate. Is that an apt comparison, do you think, or is it just one of those facile parallels that get thrown out in the media from time to time?
Well, I think there are parallels, and interestingly enough, we had Carl Bernstein in London recently, who was the author of Watergate, and he saw the parallels too.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in.
A judge made it clear that Thorbeck set out to blackmail two of the women involved in the case.
That is the first I've heard of that.
And I think they're twofold. One is about a tremendous figure of power. So we can argue about whether Rupert Murdoch, probably the most powerful media magnate the world's ever seen, compares with the president, but he's a very significant figure. And so you're dealing with somebody who's tremendously powerful and has, I think, a feeling of immunity, that he's untouchable and that he can do things that don't apply to other people. And I think the second was the cover-up. So you had something that was revealed by The Guardian 2 years ago, and for about 18 months, nothing seemed to happen. The police, the regulators, Parliament, nobody could get at this story. And what was evidently going on inside News Corporation was some kind of attempt to evade, cover up, conceal, not deal with the truth. So I think those are the parallels.
Rupert Murdoch is the world's biggest media magnate. He owns 172 newspapers right around the world, but for some reason, he seems to have garnered more political influence in Britain than in any other country. What is it about the British media and political landscapes that allowed him to do that? What is unique in this country that landed him in that position?
Well, Murdoch has, over 2 generations, built up an amazing dominance in the British landscape.
The News of the World is the most successful Sunday paper in the world.
So he owns 40% of the British press.
There's just a huge opportunity there.
Sky TV is twice the size of the BBC in terms of its revenues and budget. He is a deeply involved figure in politics. And the interesting thing is watching how he leverages these 3 things. So he's got the tabloid papers, which he uses for the kind of muscle, and as it now transpires, a network of criminals who get the dirt on people. He's got the posh papers who get the influence. He's got the broadcaster, which makes the money. And then he uses the papers to get the political influence in order to get the regulatory framework that he needs in order to make his broadcasters so lucrative.
Nice formula.
And it's a very clever formula, and it's the same picture in Australia, and he's tried a similar thing in the States.
Yeah, but he wields more might here than
it's a smaller country. It's a smaller country. I think that's the explanation. There's something about the British press which is very concentrated. It's a national press.
10 national newspapers that go everywhere.
They all go everywhere. So it would be very difficult to do in Germany or France or in the States. But so in a small country like Britain, he can absolutely get a stranglehold on British public life, really.
What was driving you when you put Nick Davies and a few others from time to time on that story and never let it go? Was it the law breaking? Was it that it was about another media organization? Or was it ideological because your organization leans left, Murdoch's leans right? Or did you just feel that this is one man with too much power and that represents a threat to British democracy?
Well, I think journalism is about looking at power, and big media organisations are amongst the most powerful things on earth. And so I think it would be very odd and dangerous if you said that media organisations shouldn't look at that nexus of power. So I wasn't ashamed or in any way abashed about looking at News Corporation. And I think the problem was the way that News Corporation reacted to our first story in July 2009. The smart thing would have been to have come out and looked at what we were saying. But once you've got people who dig in and accuse you of telling lies, which is what News International did, there's a kind of obligation to your journalist and to the truth to keep digging. And it was a long and complicated struggle because nobody wanted that story out. And so once you had the Commissioner of Police coming in to tell me to lay off this story, and the regulator saying, oh, there's no story here, the more stubborn you became, because you thought, well, what is this? Why is this almost like a conspiracy to try and stop this story coming out fully?
And what is it, in your view, that prevented other news organizations from following in your footsteps? Was it just, we do not want to attack one of our own? Was it self-interest? Or we can attack one of our own, but we're going to pick somebody other than Rupert Murdoch because of his powers and the investigative might of the organization?
I think there's a sheer aspect of fear. You know, this is a very big, nasty organization if you get on the wrong side of them. You know, that explains their dominance in politics and their influence in politics in Britain over a generation. And in a sense, the whole story was about that. It was about the use of underworld figures to dig the dirt on people. And in the same sense that I think the police and the politicians were frightened to take on this organization, I think that went for other media companies too. And they just thought, we don't want that kind of, we don't want the incoming that we're going to get from them if we look at them. So, you know, that is in a sense the reason that people didn't want to look at this story was part of the story itself.
Do you think it was the fear of News International's investigative powers that prevented the police, that was the number one reason for them not going after this investigation? Because nobody knows, or nobody would have more respect for the investigative powers of an organization like this than police who tend to investigate people for a living.
Well, we should say now that there is an investigation going.
Right, but Nick Davies did more. And one man at The Guardian did more than 52,000 members in that force.
Now, we don't know why that was. You ask the police, was it because you were frightened of News International? Of course they say no. My suspicion is that, again, that it comes back to influence and fear and dominance, and that everybody wanted to keep in with this organization. And I think there were things that News International knew about some figures in the police that made the police feel uneasy. And so there was this move to close it all down.
Well, they tried to intimidate you as well, didn't they, News International? And Nick Davies, your own reporter, says that when Rebecca Wade was asked, where will this phone hacking story end, she said, with Alan Rusbridger on his knees in front of me, begging for mercy.
Yeah, I mean, I discovered that the modus operandi of News International is quite often they drop things. You know, they sort of they tell things to your friends that you're going to hear, and lots of people have said they received indirect threats. You know, people in political life as well as in journalism.
But that must have had a chilling effect. I mean, not on your journalism necessarily, but personally. You hear a story like that from a person who's at the top of a very powerful news organization. It's got to get to you a little bit.
It's the sense of fear that this organization tries to inculcate, I think, deliberately. And one of the nice things for me at the end of this saga in July was the same police commissioner who'd been into my office and said, you're completely barking up the wrong tree, you ought to drop this. And he then sent his deputy in to come and make the same point. At the point that he resigned, he said, actually, I'm really glad The Guardian ignored what I told them, because without The Guardian digging, we would never have discovered this.
I don't want to dig too deep into the regulatory aspect of this, because that's more of a British story. But do you worry that the phone hacking story will eventually spell the end of what most people regard as a self-regulating newspaper industry? That even though the crimes were committed by News International newspapers, if not for the Guardian's dogged journalism, no one would know much about this and everyone would be just continuing on their merry, tabloidy, virtually unregulated way?
I mean, my feeling is, although we have notional regulation at the moment, we haven't really tried it. The regulator we have was shown to be completely toothless in investigating phone hacking. So my kind of mantra is, before you get rid of regulation, why don't we try it? Before you get rid of self-regulation, why don't you try it? And try a form of self-regulation with teeth and with sanctions. And if we, yeah, you know, of course I'm worried if we go beyond that. I'm completely against any form of statutory regulation, but let's try self-regulation before we abolish it.
Is it possible to say where the greatest impact, when all of this is said and done, and if it's properly investigated, where the greatest impact will be felt? Will that be in the political realm? Will it be in the area of policing? Or will it be within the British news media and potential changes that will come along on the regulatory side?
I think it's going to have lots of impacts. I mean, it's obviously going to have an impact on News Corporation and people's views of governance. And I think people are looking at News Corp now and thinking that's a very odd company, and the family's influence within that company is wrong in a British context. But there's going to be a debate about plurality and competition and how dangerous it is when one media organisation gets to a certain scale within a country, and when it blurs its political and media ambitions. And I think the third impact is going to be on journalism itself. The next 2 or 3 years are going to be quite uncomfortable in Britain as the Leveson inquiry, which was set up in response to the Guardian stories, begins to unravel the ethics and practices of journalism itself.
Well, this isn't a wiki leak. This is a wiki torrent.
With the classified military documents released by Wikileaks.
Wikileaks.
Wikileaks, eigentlich ganz genau.
And this is the next installment of Wikileaks cable.
Wikileaks.
Wikileaks has struck Washington another massive blow.
I want to talk a little bit about your partnership with Wikileaks, because you broke new ground there. In the summer of 2010, you started a partnership that, before it collapsed, ended up revealing a great deal about the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, about the U.S. view of its diplomatic partners and the rest of the world. Eventually, you went to New York, you dealt with the Germans as well, Der Spiegel. You brokered and brought together a deal that took this open source source of news, gave it mainstream media muscle, amplified the impact that that story would have on politics and journalism. And then eventually the collaboration collapsed. What I'm wondering is, was the conflict here fundamentally about personalities, or was it about cultures? And is it that difficult for an open source sort of renegade outfit like WikiLeaks to culturally get in bed and stay in bed with mainstream media outlets, or is it all destined to go wrong?
You can't get away from Julian Assange's personality.
I'm a combative person, so I like crushing bastards. If you're going to contaminate his extremely serious interview with questions about my personal life.
Well, no, I'm not.
And there's something in his personality which is more philosophical, which is difficult to pin down because he changes his story. But there are people who work with him who said it was always his intention that he wanted to get all these documents out unredacted. And we were never going to do that. You know, it was a clear understanding the 5 media organizations were never going to do that. So there was always that tension about how far we were going to push the boundaries. We did talk to governments. Assange didn't, although he offered to. So I think there's no point in denying that there were cultural tensions and there were personality tensions. But, you know, having said that, it was a small miracle to my mind that we got to the end of December last year and we published it all in a safe form, and we'd had certainly rocky times together, but we'd sort of arrived at December 2010 in a place where I think we could all look back and be pretty proud of what we've done. It's been difficult to maintain the peace since then, but I don't think that should discredit what we did.
Nick Davies helped bring the New York Times into the Wikileaks collaborations. You set up the office in New York. You worked together with the Times. That material was published in July 2010, so you're probably meeting in June on that. On September 1st, 2010, the Times did its big phone hacking story. Did you collaborate with the Times on that story?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the chronology. My memory is that we actually the phone hacking predated the WikiLeaks, because it took them a very long time to get into the phone hacking.
You were working together with them on that.
Yeah.
But were you also looking for a little company on the phone hacking story? In other words, were you tired of walking alone and knowing that some British news organizations were not willing to take on Murdoch, and that the New York Times was in a circulation war with Murdoch in New York City over Murdoch's recently acquired Wall Street Journal?
I didn't think about that, and I know that made Bill Keller, the editor, anxious that anybody should think that was why he was doing the story. I just wanted a foreign outlet who had resources, and one of the things we're learning about the world now is that there aren't many journalistic outlets who are prepared to put resource into these kind of stories. Thankfully the New York Times is still one, and that's why I went to him with that story. WikiLeaks was different. WikiLeaks, what we wanted was the First Amendment. We were going into something where we were straying into danger territory in terms of the law, and there were all kinds of people we thought would come at us over the Official Secrets Act or the Espionage Act, and we needed to attach ourselves to the American First Amendment, because anybody who was going to come for us or come for Julian Assange was going to have to go for the New York Times too. So it wasn't quite the same.
They were your constitutional
human
firewall.
Shield. Yeah,
human shield.
Which incidentally I think is a really important, one of the takeaways from that story, so the technology is complicated, the personalities were complicated, all that. But at the end of it, one of the most significant things, or perhaps the most significant thing about WikiLeaks, was this harnessing of the American First Amendment via the hinge of digital technology to countries that don't have a free press of their own. So if you're a digital citizen in Syria or Zimbabwe, you can, in a sense, leapfrog your own jurisdiction and rely on the First Amendment jurisdiction. And I think that's going to be a very significant thing in future.
I found myself over the last year or so on the Arab Revolution story, more recently on the Occupy Wall Street story. When I want to keep up to date, and without going the Twitter route, I'm on The Guardian's live blog. Now, I should be on the BBC's live blog, or I should be on an American television station's network's live blog, because I'm a television guy. But I find myself going to what was originally a print entity, because I find that your live blogs are more responsive, quicker, provide some video, but do it primarily through text. Without giving yourself too much credit for making this work, what does that say about how media are changing, about convergence, and where people will eventually go to get their breaking news?
Well, I think there are two reasons. One is The Guardian, about 3 or 4 years ago, we just announced internally and externally that we were going to be a digital-first organization. And that's a big switch to flick in your minds. And it's not necessarily the easiest sell culturally to an organization that sort of itself as a newspaper, but I believe that's our only future. So, once you become a digital organization, you then have to work around the clock. You can't say, well, we're going to give you the news tomorrow morning, and so live blogging then becomes one of the techniques that you do. And I think other organizations haven't quite got this yet. Secondly, we're an open organization. So, i.e., we're not trying to cling on to a 19th and 20th century business model where we're going to build a wall around our content. And the moment you're open, that means that you are linked into as many sources as you can. You're editing them, aggregating them, pointing to them, and being part of the web instead of just being on the web. And that made our coverage of the Arab Spring, for instance, tremendously powerful, because we were pulling lots of voices in. And so if you're a busy person and you just want to go to one source, you come to The Guardian, because it's going to be the place where we will edit, curate, and report stories in a way that's, in a sense, you don't need other media sources. And this is all about understanding what it is to be digital.
On the phone hacking story, As the story was exploding and News Corp was getting called onto the carpet, we interviewed one particular British commentator, a journalist, and he had just seen the last film in the Harry Potter series. And he said that he couldn't help but see a resemblance between Master Potter and Mr. Rusbridger. And a parallel, he said, between the demise of Voldemort and the wounding, shall we say, of the all-powerful Rupert Murdoch. You do look a little bit like him.
Yeah, Harry Potter I can live with. There was a terribly wounding article in the American press in July which said, but Alan Rusbridger is just not from Central Casting. He looks like Harry Potter's lonely uncle, which made me sound like a rather pathetic, slightly grubby figure. But if the implication is that it's a sort of David and Goliath, and there's no wizardry involved, but if it's the small guys against the big guys, then that's true. The Guardian is a small paper, and we got some big scalps.
Rupert Murdoch is fighting to save his reputation.
This is the most humble day of my life.
The Potter series is over. What do you do for a sequel now, after phone hacking, Wikileaks?
Well, I think phone hacking is not over. It's going to play out over the next 2 or 3 years in the UK context. It's yet to be seen what effect it's going to have in America. And Nick Davis is going to go and live in America once he's finished doing his phone hacking book. But there's a bigger story going on at the moment, which is about the existential threat to the media itself. And I think the ones that are going to succeed are the ones that are going to be open and more involving of the technology, which allows anybody to publish. This is the big transformation in our lifetimes. The biggest transformation probably in the last 300 or 400 years, and not many media organizations have yet, I think, tweaked to how dramatic it is. I think we have, and I think that's our big opportunity.
Alan Rusbridger, congratulations on an extraordinary 1.5 years at The Guardian, some groundbreaking journalism, and thanks for speaking to us here at the Listening Post. Finally, we touched on the Occupy Wall Street story in that interview, and we've looked at the media's coverage of that movement on previous programs because it's been all over the place, both in terms of content and tone. Our web video of the week is from jest.com. It's a US website that aggregates comedy from around the World Wide Web and occasionally produces its own material. The people at Jest are clearly of the view that some of the headlines coming out on the Occupy Wall Street story say more about the headline writers than they say about the story itself. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
The Occupy Wall Street protests are gaining steam. What's our headline?
How about Occupy Wall Street protests gain steam?
I like it. So who wants to write up the op-ed agreeing with them and then taking credit for it?
No rest protest makes bankers bonkers.
More rhyming.
Bonker bankers ranker at tanker.
Less real words.
Bank bonk tanky wonk talk.
That's great. Print it. I'm going home. It's almost noon.
Obama ruins economy, inspires shantytowns.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, this week's Occupy Wall Street cover.
Well, what did the New York Times go with? Yeah, just repost that, but in a bigger font.
Guys, the war on drugs is like total bull. We could do another redesign.
Hey, nobody reads us.